The dome goes quiet at 2:14 in the morning. Not fully quiet. A hum stays in the air around the array, the low electrical breath of a machine the size of a house. But the sweep stops. The green trace that has circled the screen inside the Dzhankoi command trailer every 4 seconds for 6 straight hours just stops turning. Somewhere under a camouflage net on a plateau in northern Crimea, the rotating antenna of a 91 N6E acquisition radar, the piece NATO calls Big Bird, the piece that anchors an entire S-400 battalion, drops to a crawl and dies. The net itself is worth a second look. 3 layers of synthetic garnish stretched over a steel frame, designed to break up the radar's silhouette against satellite and drone imagery, replaced every few months as the fabric bleaches under the Crimean sun, and starts standing out against the surrounding scrub. From 6 kilometers out, through a thermal scope, none of that camouflage matters. Heat doesn't care about paint patterns. The antenna housing runs warmer than the ground around it, whether it's spinning or not, and the coolant lines feeding the receiver modules glow faintly brighter still, a thin, bright thread running from the base of the mast down into the buried cabin below. Nobody in that trailer thinks this is the night. They have done this cooldown 100 times. Run the array too hot too long, and the receiver modules start dropping calibration, so every night, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, the crew powers the rotation down, lets the coolant loop catch up, and swaps out the overnight shift. It's the kind of maintenance window that exists in every technical manual for a system like this, buried in a paragraph about thermal tolerances that some engineer in a design bureau wrote a decade ago and never imagined would become the exploitable seam in an entire air defense network. 6 kilometers away, in a ditch that smells like wet grass and diesel, a Ukrainian reconnaissance team has been counting these minutes for 19 straight nights. Tonight the counting stops. Tonight a single aircraft, propeller barely louder than a kitchen fan, is already 40 seconds into a run nobody at that battery will see coming until it is too late to matter. This is the story of how Ukraine's military intelligence service, working off nothing but patience and a stopwatch, found the one gap in Russia's most advertised air defense system in occupied Crimea, and put a drone worth a few $100,000 through it to kill a radar Moscow had priced at $120 million. Whether that gap stayed open is a separate question. So is what happened to the officer in charge of that battery once his superiors found out how long the blind spot had been sitting there? Both get answered. Not yet. First, the target. The S-400 Triumph is Russia's premier long-range air defense system, and Moscow has spent 2 decades selling it as close to unbeatable. A single battalion can, on paper, track hundreds of aircraft and missiles at once and engage targets out past 400 kilometers. Russian state media has called it a wall nothing gets through. Western defense briefings, less flattering, have called it formidable but brittle, powerful on paper and much easier to blind than to destroy outright. The system entered service in 2007, the successor to the S-300 family that had defined Soviet and then Russian air defense doctrine for 3 decades before it. Every export customer who bought the S-400, India, Turkey, China among them, bought into the same pitch, a networked, layered shield capable of engaging stealth aircraft, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles in the same engagement window. Crimea got the real version, not the export downgrade, because Crimea after 2014 became the piece of contested territory Moscow was least willing to lose to a contested sky. That marketing pitch has taken real damage over the course of this war. S-300 and S-400 batteries in Russian-controlled territory have been struck with enough regularity since 2022 that Western analysts tracking the pattern have started treating each successful hit less as an isolated tactical win and more as a data point in a broader argument about the limits of static, radar-dependent air defense against a determined, low-cost drone campaign. Foreign militaries that bought the export version of the S-400 have reportedly asked quiet questions of their own in the years since, less about the system's engagement envelope and more about exactly the kind of human factor vulnerability this story is built around. Crimea, after 2022, became the most heavily defended patch of that wall. Sevastopol guards the fleet. Belbek and Saki guard the jets. And Dzhankoi, sitting on the peninsula's northern neck, roughly 40 kilometers south of the Chonhar land bridge, guards the approach from mainland Ukraine. Anything flying south toward Crimea's air bases or its port at Sevastopol has to cross Dzhankoi's radar coverage first. Big Bird is the eye that makes that coverage real. The 91N6E doesn't fire anything. It watches. It picks up aircraft and cruise missiles at long range, hands them to smaller engagement radars, and lets the whole battalion decide what to shoot and when. Take the eye out, and the missiles underneath it are still expensive, still lethal at close range, and suddenly half-blind. Around the radar, Russia stacked layers on purpose. Pantsir S-1 batteries, short-range gun and missile systems, built specifically to shoot down the kind of small, slow drones that have been chewing through Russian hardware since 2022. Electronic warfare trucks jamming GPS and drone control links for kilometers in every direction. And soldiers on rotating watch, because after 2 years of war, nobody in Crimea trusts sensors alone anymore. On paper, that's 4 separate problems standing between any Ukrainian weapon and the Dzhankoi radar cabin. A drone has to survive the jamming, dodge the pantsirs, avoid being spotted on approach, and still carry enough explosive to actually kill hardened electronics inside an armored housing. For most of 2024, Ukrainian planners looked at that stack and moved on to easier targets. There were, by most accounts, at least 2 prior attempts against radar installations elsewhere on the peninsula that year that ended in the drone being intercepted well short of its target, and those failures shaped how cautiously the planners approached Dzhankoi once its name came up again. Nobody wanted a third failed attempt logged against the same general concept. Then, in February 2025, a Ukrainian military intelligence cell, the kind of small analytical team that spends its days staring at drone footage and intercepted radio chatter rather than holding a rifle, noticed something in the pattern. Dzhankoi's radar wasn't running 24 hours a day. It couldn't. No radar of that size runs continuously without a maintenance window, and this crew had fallen into a lazy, predictable one. I spent a long stretch going through the operational notes on this case, and one detail kept nagging at me. The gap wasn't a secret vulnerability someone discovered through hacking or a leaked manual. It was just habit. Soldiers doing the same shift change at close to the same time, night after night, because nobody above them ever told them to vary it. That's the detail this story turns on. Not a technical exploit, a routine. Here's what a lot of coverage of this war gets backwards. People assume Russia's most advanced systems are watched over by its most disciplined crews. The Dzhankoi detachment wasn't undisciplined by any normal standard. This was still an active-duty S-400 battalion defending occupied territory under constant surveillance. But discipline erodes on a schedule nobody's enforcing variation on. 2 years of war does that. Fatigue does that. The team assigned to this analysis wasn't large. By the accounts that have circulated since, it numbered somewhere around 6 people split across 2 functions: an observation element working the physical watch from static positions near the battery, and an analysis element further back, cross-referencing what the observers logged against signals intelligence pulled from a separate collection unit entirely. Neither half knew much about the other's methods. Standard compartmentalization for an operation that everyone involved understood could get people killed if it leaked. The Ukrainian team started logging it. Every night, an observation post working off a long-range thermal camera and a passive RF sensor would note when the antenna's rotation slowed, when it stopped, how long the pause lasted, and when the crew truck rolled in for the shift change. They did this for 19 nights before they trusted the pattern enough to act on it. 19 nights of watching a target and doing nothing is not a glamorous phase of a war story. It's also the part that made the strike possible. The living conditions for that observation team deserve their own mention, if only because they're so far removed from the image most people have of modern intelligence work. No satellite uplink humming in a climate-controlled trailer. A dug-in position under scrub brush, a car battery rigged to keep the thermal optics powered through an 8-hour watch, and rotating 2-man shifts because staring through a scope at a fixed point for more than 4 hours starts producing false positives. A shifting shadow read as movement, a flock of birds mistaken for a vehicle. The team ate cold rations because a heated meal produces a thermal signature of its own, one visible to exactly the kind of equipment they were hoping to exploit on the other side. They logged times by hand in a notebook because a laptop screen at that range, even dimmed, was judged an unacceptable risk. One entry from the observation log, reconstructed after the fact from debrief notes, reads simply, Night 11, rotation stopped 0211, resumed 0239. Crew truck arrival unchanged. 28 minutes, recorded with the same flat tone as every other night, no indication yet that this number would eventually matter more than almost anything else logged that spring. The first real obstacle came in week 2, when a stretch of low cloud rolled in off the Sea of Azov and sat over Dzhankoi for 4 straight nights. The observation post's thermal camera could barely resolve the antenna dome through the moisture, let alone time the cooldown to the minute. The team almost lost the thread entirely. Without a clean read on the pattern, every night of prior observation risked becoming useless guesswork. They solved it by cross-referencing the thermal gaps they could get with intercepted electronic emissions logged by a separate signals unit, rebuilding the missing nights from radio silence instead of pictures. That signals unit picked up something the thermal team couldn't dug: the radar's own electromagnetic signature, dropping off a passive receiver's waterfall display the instant the rotation stopped, and climbing back the instant it resumed, regardless of what the weather was doing to visibility on the ground. It wasn't as precise as a direct visual. The RF red could confirm the radar had gone quiet, but couldn't independently confirm crew movement the way the thermal camera could. But it was enough to bridge 4 nights that would otherwise have been a gap in the data at exactly the point the team needed continuity most. By early March, the picture was clear. The cooldown window ran, on most nights, from roughly 2:10 a.m. to somewhere near 2:40 a.m. Half an hour, sometimes a little less. During that window, the 91N6E's own radar coverage of its immediate surroundings, the very thing that would normally help detect an incoming drone at range, went soft. Not blind, soft. The Pantsir units nearby kept their own independent radars running, so the corridor was never wide open. But it was open enough, for long enough, if the approach was flown low and slow, and from the right angle. What's most surprising about this case isn't that Ukraine found a gap in the S-400 umbrella. Ukraine had been probing that umbrella for 2 years by this point, with mixed results and plenty of losses along the way. The surprising part is how unglamorous the winning method turned out to be. No stolen documents, no cyber intrusion, just a folding chair, a thermal scope, and 19 nights of somebody writing down times in a notebook. Command sat on the intelligence for almost 3 more weeks, not because anyone doubted it, because launching too early, on the first plausible night, risked burning a fragile window before the strike package was actually ready. There's a smaller, quieter piece of this phase, worth mentioning. The analysis team spent part of that 3-week wait trying to understand why the pattern existed at all, not just when it occurred. Pulling apart the 91N6E's known technical documentation, publicly available manufacturer material, some of it, along with material gathered from earlier examples of the system captured or destroyed elsewhere in the war, they concluded the cooldown wasn't a safety margin built with generous slack. It was closer to the minimum the receiver modules could tolerate before calibration drift started producing false returns. In other words, the crew wasn't being lazy by taking that window. They needed it, which made the pattern almost impossible to eliminate through better discipline alone, short of physically staggering shift changes across the clock, in a way nobody had apparently thought to order. The observation cell had their pattern. What they didn't have yet was a drone that could survive the last 500 meters. That part of the plan almost fell apart entirely, and it fell apart over something as ordinary as a fuel line. The aircraft chosen for the job was the Bobber, Ukrainian for Beaver, a long-range strike drone that had been quietly reshaping how Ukraine hits targets deep behind the front line since 2023. It isn't fast. It isn't stealthy in any exotic sense. What it is cheap, expendable, and able to fly hundreds of kilometers on a fixed-wing airframe, carrying a warhead heavy enough to do real damage. Estimates on unit cost vary, depending on the version and payload, but most assessments put a single Bobber well under $250,000. A rounding error next to the missiles an S-400 battalion is built to fire. The Bobber's development history is itself a small case study in how this war has forced improvisation into a weapons program. Early variants, flown in the second half of 2023, were reportedly plagued by navigation drift over long ranges. Good enough for a target measured in tens of kilometers, unreliable past 100. Engineers iterated fast, swapping in better inertial navigation modules and refining the waypoint-following software between successive production batches, the kind of rapid, field-driven revision that a peacetime defense program would spread across years instead of months. By the version flown against Dzhankoi in April 2025, the airframe had already logged strikes against fuel depots, ammunition storage, and at least one airbase deep inside Russian-controlled territory, each mission quietly refining the operator's confidence in exactly how far they could push it and under what conditions it was likely to fail. Compare that to the 91N6E it was about to be sent after. A single Big Bird radar, fully outfitted with its command cabin, antenna array, and support electronics, runs somewhere in the neighborhood of $120 million, not counting the launchers, missiles, and support vehicles that make up the rest of the battalion around it. That's the exchange the planners were staring at. One aircraft costing a few $100,000, aimed at a piece of hardware worth roughly 500 times that. Put yourself in the position of the mission planner staring at that math in mid-March. Every previous Bober strike against a hardened target in Crimea had a failure rate attached to it. Some intercepted by Pantsir fire, some lost to jamming, some simply falling short on fuel. You are betting a single airframe and weeks of patient reconnaissance on a half-hour window that might not even repeat itself on the night you finally launch. The route planning took another obstacle head-on. Dzhankoi's Pantsir batteries weren't stationary decorations. Their crews rotated coverage sectors, and a flight path that looked clear on a map drawn from 2-week-old satellite imagery could put the drone directly under an active gun barrel by the time it actually flew. The team solved this the only way available to them: constant re-verification. Every few days, fresh drone reconnaissance and intercepted Pantsir radio traffic updated the sector map, so the approach corridor being flown on strike night was never more than 48 hours stale. A second, less obvious obstacle surfaced during this stretch of planning: fuel load versus warhead weight. The Bober's total payload capacity forces a trade-off between how much explosive it carries and how far it can fly, while still holding enough reserve for a terminal maneuver if the approach needs correcting mid-flight. Loaded heavy enough to guarantee the 91N6E's cabin didn't survive the blast, the airframe's range margin shrank uncomfortably close to the distance from the planned launch site to Dzhankoi. Planners spent nearly a week debating whether to move the launch site closer, trading concealment for range, or trim the warhead and accept a smaller chance of a clean kill. They chose to keep the warhead as planned and instead relocate the launch position roughly 11 kilometers south into a patch of tree line that offered comparable concealment at a shorter flight distance, buying back just enough fuel margin to make both planners comfortable. By the last week of March, the plan had a shape: launch from a site well north of the Chandhar Isthmus, well outside the range where Dzhankoi's own systems would notice a slow, low-flying contact on radar. Fly the bulk of the route at altitude low enough to stay under most look-down radar coverage, navigating by pre-programmed waypoints rather than live GPS, since GPS near Crimea gets jammed hard enough to be functionally useless. Time the final approach to cross into the Pantsir engagement zone during the cooldown window, when both the primary radar and, historically, crew attention dropped. The jamming problem deserves more attention than a single sentence gives it. Russian electronic warfare units operating around Crimea by 2025 were running a dense, overlapping mesh of GPS spoofing and outright signal denial, strong enough that civilian aircraft transiting the wider Black Sea region routinely reported GPS position errors of tens of kilometers, sometimes appearing to fly over airports hundreds of miles from their actual position. A drone relying on live satellite navigation through that mesh wouldn't just lose precision, it could be walked entirely off course by a spoofed signal, without ever registering an error. The Bober's inertial navigation system, essentially dead reckoning, refined by onboard sensors rather than external signal, sidesteps that problem at the cost of accumulating small positional drift over a long flight. Engineers accounted for that drift by building in periodic waypoint corrections keyed to distinctive terrain features rather than GPS coordinates, effectively letting the drone check its own math against the ground itself at several points during the route, rather than trusting a signal that could, and likely would, lie to it. There's a line in the after-action notes on this operation that reads almost like something out of a heist film. The window isn't the radar going dark. The window is the 15 minutes after that, when everyone on shift is thinking about coffee and the handoff log, not the sky. In the final days before the planned launch, the ground crew responsible for prepping the airframe ran through a checklist that had grown longer with every mission since the program's first flights. Fuel line pressure tests, control surface calibration, a final weight and balance check with the warhead mounted, and a software verification pass on the waypoint file to make sure nobody had transposed a coordinate during the last route revision. One technician, according to notes from the unit, ran the waypoint file 3 separate times through an independent verification tool before signing off, a level of redundancy that had become standard practice after an earlier mission elsewhere on the front was lost to what investigators later concluded was a single transposed digit in a launch coordinate. April 10th came and went. Weather again, this time wind gusting hard enough out of the northwest that flight planners judged the Bober's fuel margin too tight to guarantee it reached the target and had enough left for the terminal run. They scrubbed the launch 12 hours out. For the team that had spent almost 2 months building this operation, watching a green light turn red at the last minute is its own kind of miserable. Ground crew who had already fueled the airframe had to partially drain and re-verify the load rather than risk degraded fuel sitting in the lines for an extra day. An unglamorous few hours of work that nobody outside the unit will ever hear about. The night of April 11th, 2025, the wind dropped. At 1:22 a.m., a Bober lifted off from a strip well north of the front line. Its route ran south across open farmland, then over the Chonhar corridor, then down into the airspace Ukrainian intelligence had spent 2 months mapping meter by meter. For nearly 50 minutes, the drone flew in silence that mattered enormously and meant nothing dramatic was happening yet. Low fuel-efficient cruise, no radio chatter, no visible signature beyond a small thermal bloom from its engine, one easy to miss against the background noise of a cold Crimean night. The operators monitoring the flight from the relay point had almost nothing to do during this stretch besides watch a single blinking marker crawl across a map and resist the urge to check in on frequency, since any transmission risked drawing attention from the same electronic warfare trucks the whole plan was built to avoid. At 2:09 a.m., an observation post, 6 kilometers from the battery, watched through a thermal scope as the 91 N6E's rotation began to slow. Right on schedule, the crew was starting their shutdown. At 2:14, the antenna stopped turning entirely. That's the moment this story opened on. Now you know why it mattered. Here's the layer nobody watching that drone in real time actually knew yet. Even with the radar's own rotation stopped, the Pantsir units around it were still live, still scanning, still perfectly capable of shredding a slow-moving drone if a crew happened to glance at the right screen at the right second. The cooldown bought a soft spot. It didn't buy safety. Whether the Bober would actually clear those last 500 meters was still, genuinely, a coin flip. One of the Pantsir crews stationed roughly 400 meters from the radar cabin that night was, according to intercepted personnel traffic recovered afterward, mid-rotation itself, a conscript gunner barely 6 months into his posting, working alongside a more experienced senior sergeant who had been with the unit since before the full-scale invasion began. Neither name has been confirmed in open reporting, and this isn't the place to speculate about identities that haven't been independently verified. What the intercepts do suggest is a crew that, like the radar operators 40 meters away, had absorbed the same institutional complacency that comes from months of quiet nights where nothing happens. The gunner's shift log, referenced obliquely in a later administrative inquiry, reportedly noted nothing unusual in the hour before the strike. Not a criticism of him specifically, but a small human data point in a story that keeps circling back to the same theme. Routine dulls vigilance faster than any single mistake ever could. The drone dropped altitude as it crossed into the outer edge of the Pantsir coverage ring, flying low enough that ground clutter, trees, low rises in the terrain, the radar shadow thrown by a scattering of farm buildings, broke up its return signature. Ukrainian operators monitoring the flight from a relay point further north lost telemetry twice in the final approach, each dropout lasting only seconds, each one long enough to make a room full of people stop breathing. The first dropout came at 2:12, as the drone threaded a gap between 2 low ridgelines the mission planners had identified weeks earlier from satellite terrain data as the best available masking feature on the whole approach. Telemetry returned 9 seconds later. The second dropout, shorter, came almost exactly at the perimeter fence line, and by the account of one operator present in the relay room that night, was the longer 9 seconds of the two, despite lasting barely half as long in actual clock time. Telemetry came back both times. The drone held its programmed course. At 2:16 a.m., it crossed the perimeter fence of the Dzhankoi battery position at an altitude Ukrainian reconstructions later placed at under 30 meters. Nobody fired at it, not because nobody saw it. Post-strike intercepts suggest at least one Pantsir operator did register a contact on a secondary display in the final seconds. Too late, too low, too fast a decision to make with a crew still mid-shift change, and a system that had just spent 30 minutes explicitly not looking for anything. Reconstructing those final seconds from the Russian side is inherently harder since it relies on fragments of intercepted radio traffic rather than a clean account, but the fragments that do exist paint a consistent picture, A single voice calling out a contact, a beat of confused crosstalk as more than one operator tried to confirm what they were looking at, and then nothing coherent at all once the detonation made the question irrelevant. The Bober's warhead detonated against the base of the 91N6E's rotating antenna and the adjoining command cabin at 2:16 and 40 seconds. Thermal imagery captured afterward showed the antenna housing collapsed inward, one of the support struts sheared clean, and a fire in the cabin's electronics bay that took ground crews almost 20 minutes to fully suppress. Whatever was inside that cabin, receiver modules, signal processors, the accumulated calibration data from months of operation, was gone in the first 90 seconds. Forensic assessment of the aftermath, pieced together from imagery Ukrainian intelligence obtained through drone overflight 3 days after the strike, identified at least 4 major components as total losses: the antenna array itself, the traveling wave tube amplifiers that gave the radar its transmit power, the primary signal processor rack, and roughly 40 meters of waveguide cabling connecting the antenna to the cabin below. None of those components are things you keep in a spare parts depot for quick swap-in. Traveling wave tubes, in particular, are typically manufactured in small batches to exacting tolerances, and a damaged unit can mean weeks of delay rather than days, depending on what stock the manufacturer has on hand at the time. By most accounts, the cabin was manned at the moment of detonation, standard practice during a shift change when outgoing and incoming crew overlap briefly to hand off status. Casualty figures from the strike have never been officially confirmed by either side, which is itself unremarkable. Russian authorities have a consistent pattern of not publishing casualty numbers from strikes inside occupied Crimea, for reasons that likely have as much to do with morale management as operational security. What can be said is that a strike landing during a shift change, by design, maximizes the number of people inside a target structure rather than minimizing it, a fact the mission planners were certainly aware of, even if it wasn't the primary driver behind the timing. One drone, one warhead. Somewhere in the range of $120 million of Russian air defense infrastructure, blind. What strikes me about this case, more than the technical details, is what it says about the gap between how Russia has marketed the S-400 for 2 decades and how it actually performs against patient, cheap, asymmetric pressure. The system itself worked exactly as designed for 30 straight minutes a night. It just also, by design, had to stop working for 30 minutes a night. Nobody built a plan around covering that gap, because on paper, the gap was supposed to be too short to matter. It mattered. Here's where this story could have ended cleanly, and didn't. Word from the battery reached the Regional Air Defense Command inside 20 minutes, and the first instinct wasn't to investigate how a Beaver drone had walked past a battalion of some of the most advanced ground-based air defense hardware Russia owns. The first instinct, according to intercepted traffic in the hours that followed, was to figure out who would be blamed. The reconstruction of that first hour of command traffic is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reads less like a crisis response and more like an argument moving up a chain of command in real time. The battery commander's initial report reportedly framed the loss as a sophisticated, unforeseeable penetration of the defensive network, language that shifts responsibility toward the broader system rather than any specific decision made on site. Whoever received that report at the regional level apparently wasn't satisfied with it, because within the hour a second, more detailed accounting was demanded, one that would eventually surface the cooldown schedule and how long it had run unchanged. In the days after the strike, Russian security personnel reportedly conducted individual interviews with every member of the battery who had been on shift that night, a process that outside observers might reasonably call an interrogation, even if Russian accounts characterized it as a routine debrief. Soldiers were asked, separately and repeatedly, to walk through the exact sequence of the cooldown procedure, whether it had ever been altered, and whether anyone outside the unit had ever shown unusual interest in the schedule. That last question is telling. It suggests that somewhere in the chain of command, someone had already begun to suspect this wasn't luck, that the enemy had been watching long enough to know exactly when to strike, and that the leak, if there was one, might not have been a leak at all, just an observable pattern that nobody had bothered to hide. No account of these interviews has ever surfaced with names attached, and it's likely none ever will. Unpopular opinion, but I'll say it anyway. The officer running that battery's nightly cooldown routine wasn't incompetent. He was following a maintenance procedure that almost certainly existed on paper long before he took command, doing the version of his job that gets radars replaced every few years without frying their receivers from overheating. The failure here wasn't one man cutting a corner. It was an institution that let a defensive schedule calcify into something an enemy could set a watch by. That's a systems failure. And systems failures are a lot less satisfying to report on than a single scapegoat, but they're the more honest story. With the radar down, the battalion's engagement radars, the smaller systems that actually guide missiles onto targets, were still technically functional, but without Big Bird's long-range picture feeding them targets, their effective coverage against anything approaching from the north collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. For a battery whose entire purpose was watching the approach from mainland Ukraine toward Crimea's interior, that's close to the worst possible failure mode. Russian military logistics moved fast, to their credit. Within roughly 96 hours, a replacement radar unit, reports differ on whether it was a fresh 91N6E or a mobile stopgap system pulled from reserve stock, was being trucked south toward Dzhankoi under heavy escort. Getting a system that size operational isn't a plug-and-play job. Calibration alone typically takes days once the unit is physically in place and connected. The convoy moving that replacement unit reportedly took a route deliberately varied from the standard logistics corridor used for prior equipment transfers into Crimea, a small but telling admission that whoever was managing the response understood the same pattern recognition problem that had just cost them a radar. If Ukrainian reconnaissance had been watching supply routes as patiently as it had watched the cooldown schedule, a predictable convoy path would have been its own kind of gift. Would you have noticed a 30-minute gap in your own routine? If you'd been running the same shift change schedule for months without anyone above you ever asking you to change it? It's easy to watch this from the outside and call it obvious in hindsight. It rarely feels obvious from inside the routine. For roughly 5 to 6 days, depending on which account you trust, Dzhankoi's coverage of the northern approach into Crimea ran meaningfully thinner than it had before April 11th. Ukrainian reconnaissance flights over the following week reported markedly less resistance in a corridor that had, for the better part of 2 years, been one of the more heavily watched stretches of airspace on the peninsula. What Ukraine actually did with that corridor in the days that followed is still only partially confirmed. Multiple sources point to at least one additional strike package moving through the same general approach within the following week, hitting a separate target further south. The details of that follow-up operation haven't been fully declassified. What is confirmed is that the Dzhankoi gap didn't stay open by accident for long, and that whoever exploited it moved fast enough to suggest the plan for a follow-up strike was already sitting ready before the first drone ever launched. That's a layered piece of this story worth sitting with for a second. The Bober strike on the radar wasn't really the operation, it was the door. Whatever moved through that door in the days after is arguably the more consequential half of this, and it's the half that stays murkiest. There's a detail in the post-strike accounting that stuck with me more than the dollar figure did. Russian state media, in its brief acknowledgement of an incident at a facility in Dzhankoi district, never used the words radar, S-400, or air defense. The framing was deliberately vague, consistent with how Moscow has handled almost every embarrassing strike inside Crimea since 2022. Compare that pattern to how the same outlets cover Ukrainian losses in exhaustive, specific detail, and the asymmetry in how each side controls its own story becomes impossible to miss. That asymmetry runs both directions, worth noting. Ukrainian officials have historically been just as reluctant to confirm operational details of strikes like this one while the war is ongoing, for reasons that have nothing to do with propaganda and everything to do with not handing the next battery commander a clean list of what went wrong so he can fix it before the next patient observation team shows up outside his fence line. Some of the ambiguity in this story isn't spin, it's operational security, doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Add up the numbers on this one operation, and the ratio is stark even by the standards of this war. A Bober airframe in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars, a radar cabin worth roughly $120 million, a battalion's effective coverage cut to a fraction of normal for the better part of a week, and, if the follow-up strikes in the days after are confirmed as connected, additional damage inflicted through the exact corridor the first strike opened. No single strike wins a war. This one didn't restore Ukrainian air superiority over Crimea, didn't collapse the broader S-400 network protecting the peninsula, and didn't stop Russia from eventually restoring full coverage at Dzhankoi once the replacement radar finished calibration. Context matters here, and it would be dishonest to oversell one radar kill as some kind of turning point. What it did do is add one more data point to a pattern that's been building since 2023, that even Russia's best-marketed air defense systems have operational habits, human routines, predictable rhythms that a patient enough observer can map and exploit. The S-400 didn't fail because it's a bad system. It failed because the people running one specific battery of it fell into a rhythm, and somebody on the other side of the front line was disciplined enough to notice. Zoom out far enough, and this single strike becomes one line in a much longer ledger. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian forces have claimed credit for damaging or destroying air defense radars, launchers, and command posts across occupied Crimea and southern Russia dozens of times over, using everything from naval drones to modified Soviet-era missiles to exactly this kind of long-range, fixed-wing strike drone. Most of those claims are hard to verify independently, and even harder to weigh against each other in terms of actual strategic impact. What sets the Dzhankoi strike apart isn't its size. It's how cleanly the method maps onto a repeatable lesson. Watch long enough, and even a system built to watch everything will eventually show you the 30 minutes it isn't. We had to leave out a few of the more granular intercept details from this reconstruction, mostly because they haven't been independently corroborated yet outside of the initial reporting. If a fuller account surfaces, we'll probably come back to this one. So, to close the loop this story opened with, the gap did get closed. Roughly a week after the strike, with the replacement radar calibrated and back online, Dzhankoi's coverage returned to something close to its prior baseline. But baseline isn't the same as unbroken confidence. Every account of the following months describes a battalion that varied its shutdown schedule, rotated its cooldown windows, and never again let a routine run predictable for 19 straight nights. The lesson, once learned at the cost of $120 million, tends to stick. The officer in command of the battery was reportedly reassigned within weeks, quietly, without the kind of public accountability that would confirm exactly what happened to him next. That detail, like a few others in this story, sits in the space between confirmed and merely plausible. We've marked it that way on purpose. One radar, one drone, one half-hour habit that cost a fortune to learn from. If you want the story of what Ukraine sent through that corridor in the days after Dzhankoi went dark, that's a separate reconstruction, and it's one of the more contested engagements we've looked into. Subscribe if you want it when it's ready.